A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. You are for honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Feel a sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Betrayer of the light. For Lord Oran. Of course. Justice has come. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Betrayer of the light. For honor. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. You are past death. For Lord Oran. For my father. Feel my wrath. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. You are past death. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. What is it? Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Betrayer of the light. Foul name. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Betrayer of the light. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. I'm here to help. For honor. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Feel my wrath. Justice has come. Certainly. Feel my wrath. Justice has come for my father the king. Bow me. For my father the king. Justice has come. Of course, a sound plan. Of course, for honor. A sound plan. For honor. You are past redemption. Of course, for honor. Of course, a sound plan. Of course, a sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course, for honor. Certainly. Of course. Betrayer of the light. You are past redemption. Feel my wrath.
Killing spree.
Certainly. For honor. For my father. A sound plan. Betrayer of the light. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. You are past redemption. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. For my father the king. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. The light is my strength. For honor. Justice shall be done. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Betrayer of the light. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. You are past redemption. For honor. Of course.
Our allied town needs help.
Foul name. Betrayer of the light. Foul name. You are past redemption. For honor.
Killing
Sound
spree.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Foul name.
Our allied town needs help.
Feel my wrath. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. More work?
Are you threatening me?
I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Betrayer of the light. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Our
Certainly.
allies' town needs help.
I stand for the light. For honor. Of
Killing
course.
spree.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. For honor. Justice. Foul name. For my father the king. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Feel my wrath. You are past redemption. For my father the king. You are past redemption. Certainly. A sound plan.
past redemption. Foul name.
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course.
For Lord Oran.
For honor.
For my father, the king.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Killing spree.
Of course. Certainly.
Double kill.
Our allies' town needs help. Our allies' town needs help.
Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. The light is strength. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Killing spree.
A sound
Our
plan.
allies' town needs help.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Justice is come.
Certainly. For honor. Of course.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
For my father, the king.
For honor. Of course. Sound. For honor. A sound plan.
Our allies' town needs
Trail
help.
of light.
For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Justice has come. For Lord Oran. Betrayer of the light.
Dominating.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Our allies' town
For
needs
honor.
help.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
Mega kill.
For honor. A sound plan.
For my father, the king. Foul.
How may I serve?
What? Justice shall be done.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. For my father, the king.
Justice.
For my father, the king.
You are past redemption. Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. For honor.
For Lord Oran.
Certainly. A sound plan. For my father, the king. Of course.
Betrayer of the light. For Lord Oran. You are past redemption.
For honor.
Feel my wrath. For Lord Oran.
Double kill.
My father, the king.
Betrayer of the light. Feel my
Double
wrath.
kill spree.
For honor.
Our allies' town needs help.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
For my father, the king.
Your man.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
For Lord Oran. Justice is come.
For honor.
For Lord Oran. You are past redemption.
Double kill.
For honor. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Our allied town needs help.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Our allied
Certainly.
town needs help.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Monster kill!
Of course.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy. Our allied town needs help.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Our allied town needs help.
For honor.
For my father, the king.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Killing
A sound
spree.
plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
Justice has come. Betrayer of the light.
Dominating kill.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Light justice shall be done. Foul name.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Is there danger?
Justice has come.
Certainly.
For my father, the king.
A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light. For my father, the king. Foul knave.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
For my father, the king.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
You are past redemption.
Certainly.
Foul knave.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Justice shall be done. I stand for the light.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our warriors have engaged.
Mega kill.
A sound plan. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
Unstoppable.
Certainly.
Triple kill.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Our
A sound
allied
plan.
town needs help.
Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
For Lord Oran. Justice has come.
A sound plan. Certainly. For
Our
honor.
allied
A
town
sound
needs help.
plan. Certainly. For honor.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. For honor. course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Double kill.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
I am ready.
Light is my strength. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy.
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Killing spree. Killing spree. Dominating kill.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound
Killing spree.
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Is there danger?
Mega kill.
Our allies' town needs help.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. I stand for honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound
Unstoppable. Wicked sick. Double kill.
for honor. Of course. A sound plan.
Justice has come.
Of course.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
You are past redemption.
Of course. For honor. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
For Lord Oran.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
Foul knave.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Light is my strength. Certainly.
Killing spree.
A sound plan.
Killing spree.
Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Dominating. Double kill. Wicked. Monster kill.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Is there danger?
Holy shit! Killing spree! Double kill!
Our allied town needs help. Our allied Our allies' town needs help.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. I stand for the line. Certainly.
Our allies'
A
town
sound
needs
plan.
help.
For honor. A sound plan.
Holy shit!
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Justice has come.
Our allies' town needs help.
Of course. For honor.
For my father. Justice has come. You are past redemption.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. The light is my strength. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. For my father, the king.
You are past redemption. Betrayal of the light.
Of course. Certainly. Sound. For honor.
Our allied town needs
A
help.
sound plan. For honor.